I want to clarify something in that beautiful and gorgeous Dharma recapitulation. And this is where I want to start this week, because we really need to model how do we be in this time. Who we are is who we are in this time. Who we become is how we transform and deepen in this time. And we need to model what we should be saying as spiritual beings, having a human experience. We need to model what we need to be saying politically, geopolitically. We need to model what we're saying economically. We need to model what we're saying medically, right? How do we actually be the most gorgeous humans that we need to be at this moment in time? And I want to start, friends, and I want to do this so gently, right, with what we need to be doing as spiritual teachers. So when we say that the germ is not merely a pathogen, I want to be really careful. The germ is a pathogen, right? The virus is a formal structure that has obviously real, definitive medical implications. It's a formal embodied structure, and it's spread as a formal embodied structure. And we don't mean in any sense that some abstract failure of love on the planet went and in some woo-woo way created a germ. That's not the case. That's a huge mistake. That's not the claim that anyone should be making. And I want to get that really clear. That's really important, right? When prophets of the old churches would say people are suffering because they sinned, that was a great tragedy. And that was a way, it was an egoic move. We're suffering, we seem to have no control. Let's say that we sinned for punishment, because that's a way of regaining control. Does that make sense, everyone? Right? So it wasn't a pious move, it was a control move. I can't sit in the mystery, it's too painful. And I understand that, right? And I'm with you, we're together, and the mystery is often painful. And we're going to talk about what it means to sit in the mystery. But the control move is a desecration. Now, that same move to gain control by saying I sinned. Now, why does saying I sinned and therefore I'm punished give me control? Because then I can stop sinning. Right? If I did something to cause it, then I've regained control, because I can stop doing what I did to cause it. And therefore, the equation should mean it won't happen anymore. So that's a human move to gain control in the face of the mystery. Now, it's a legitimate move when it comes to science. We got to be really careful not to adopt fundamentalist forms. The AIDS virus happened because God was punishing homosexuality. God forbid. That's a desecration. We've got to be very careful. So this pandemic is not the result of some sort of abstract failure of love. That's not what anyone should be saying. It's not what we're saying. So we're going to model precisely what we are saying. So that's number one. But number two, the New Age world is, of course, making the same version of that mistake as it always has. The New Age world says something like, you're suffering, you attracted it into your life. Either you personally attracted it, you created that, you created your suffering, right? And I can't tell you how many across the world popular New Age forums there are that are saying the precise same thing as the medieval religions, just dressing it up in a different language. So if the medieval religions talked in terms of sin, the New Age world talks in terms of the law of attraction. You've attracted it into your life. That's why it's there, which means that if you're suffering, you created it. No, and no, and no, and no again. That is to say, now I want you to, let's going to take this slow. There's a place, and we'll talk about it, for transforming fate into destiny. There's a place for taking suffering and turning it into transformation. Let's put that aside. We're going to get there. But you never, ever, ever have a right to say to a person or to a planet, the reason you're suffering is because you sinned, or the reason you're suffering is because you attracted it into your life. Those are both great violations. And I want to stay with me. I want to get this so deeply. I want to give you another example before we go more deeply into this. And I'm sharing this with you because so much has come across my text and my desk right over the last week and into my heart from people writing from all over the world. How do we relate to these things? Right? How do we understand? Did we attract this? So let's be really clear. When we encounter suffering, we hold the person who's suffering and we pour love into them, and we pour medicine, and we pour ventilators, right? And we pour supply side systems that are working, and we do everything we can to prevent medical overload, and we do a full-on containment strategy, not just mitigation, but actually, right, a strategy which moves to utterly flatten the curve with a complete and total global lockdown for a short period of time, and in order to flatten the curve completely to prevent further suffering. And then we hold the people that are dying. And I want to talk about that in a couple of minutes, but that's what we do. And the one thing we don't do, right, is to figure out who to blame. And who to blame is always the other people. It's the Democrats or it's the Republicans, right, in America. This is not a time for demonizing, right? This is a time for actually understanding that no one, literally no one's left out of the circle. And there's no us, them. In the New Age, and here, Terry Nelson, my friend Terry, here I need to critique this New Age moment, particularly because it's important, because it's flying all over the internet. The New Age does the same us, them move, it just changes who the them is. Okay, there's no them now. It's one world. It's one love, right? It's one heart. And we're together in this. And together we rise, right? Can you feel that, everybody? Together we rise. We're holding hands. Let's hold hands, right? Literally around the world, holding hands. One love, one world, one heart. And I want to talk more about that, but first I want to just show you an example. We're going to play 30 to 60 seconds of a clip that a whole bunch of people send me this week. And the clip is about, let's thank the virus, because the virus can cause all this transformation. So we want to thank the virus.
Thank you for shaking us and showing us we are dependent on something much bigger than we think. Thank you for making us appreciate the luxury we lived in, abundance of products, freedom, health, and realizing we were taking it for granted. Thank you for stopping us, to make us see how lost we were in the busyness, not having time for the most basic things. Thank you for allowing us to put aside all our problems we thought were so important and showing us what is actually important. Thank you for stopping.
That's a disaster. We don't thank the coronavirus, friends. Do you understand that? Right? This is precisely why spirituality in its new forms that are so important and so needed has so little impact. Is it true? Is the premise of this clip true that transformation can come out of this catastrophe? Of course it's true. Is it true that there's deep understandings that we have when our lives are radically stopped? Of course that's true. But you don't thank the coronavirus, do you understand? Right? Let me give an example. It's absolutely true that the state of Israel was in part emergent from the ashes of the Holocaust, where most of my family was killed. But we don't thank the gas chambers. Do you understand? Because people are dying, right? 12,000 people were gassed every day in Auschwitz in 1944. Yes, the state of Israel arose from it. We don't thank the gas chambers. Andrew Sullivan wrote a beautiful column talking about what emerged from AIDS. Andrew Sullivan's a great writer, and he's an AIDS activist, a gay man, very, very prescient and good insight into the structures of society. So Andrew writes about the good that emerged from the AIDS epidemic. That's absolutely true. There is good that emerged from the AIDS epidemic, but we don't thank the AIDS virus as people are dying all around us. Let's just understand this, right? When Gal Gadot, Gal, love you, sweetheart, love you, sister Israel, we live right near each other in Israel, but goes online and sings with uber wealthy friends, Imagine, right? In this moment, whoa, let's slow it down for a second. 70%, let's just take the United States as an example, but it's true throughout the world. 70% in the United States, ostensibly one of the wealthier countries in the world, 70% of the United States lives from paycheck to paycheck. 12,000 workers were just laid off yesterday from various airports with no severance, meaning no ability to actually pay for basic necessities in this next month. No, thank you, virus. Italy, doctors, right now, this week, today, yesterday, doctors are deciding who should get the ventilator. Right? Wow. And if you notice, friends, notice there's almost no stories, right, available. I searched last night about individual cases of people dying. So there's a virtual blackout on actually individual suffering. There's number 571. There's X amount of cases. Do you notice that, friends? It's trends and it's statistics and it's economic implications and it's stock markets and it's mega analysis. And that's all important and that needs to be done. But friends, outrageous lovers, people are dying, right? And what we're understanding is that we're living in this moment where this death is caused not as a prophetic statement, not as a new age statement, not as a fundamentalist statement. What we said last week is we need to look at the fact pattern. You get the distinction? The fact pattern that created the pandemic. The fact pattern that created the pandemic is a failure of intimacy. But that's not, stay with me really closely because I want to explain that. Because we got to model good sense making here. We're living in this moment where we need to be doing sense making. And there's no central sense making. There's no top-down sense making that's happening, which is both good and disastrous. It has two dimensions and we're going to look at it. We need to do decentralized sense making. Does that make sense, everyone? So we need to make sense of this, right? And when we make sense of this, we need to understand what actually is happening here. So there's a global intimacy disorder that expresses itself, excuse me, thank you, on multiple levels. So for example, Wuhan, China, right? In Wuhan, China, there are open wet markets. In the open wet markets, dogs are killed in front of you and you eat them because you're poor. It's not because, as I've seen some expressions on web, let's honor Chinese culture, right? Where we kill dogs in front of people and it's part of the culture. No, the same way we don't honor the travesties, let's say in Indian culture, in which widows are burned after their husband dies. No, there are universal principles, right? There's a new story where we share a universal ethos. We don't burn widows because they did it in Indian culture at a particular time. No, we actually are moving from this pre-modern moment to a universal set of shared principles, right? And let's be really careful here. And we don't honor the Chinese wet markets, right? Which are brutalizing animals. I mean, brutalizing. There was an incredible interview with Jane Goodall, who the great animal activist, right? Who worked with animals her whole life, with Anderson Cooper. One of the great brutalities of this century, right, is the concentration camps literally that we put animals in order to fatten them to eat our minute of lamb chops. But actually the Chinese wet markets are entire populations that are poor, that don't want to be eating live bats. And actually that is, to the best of our scientific knowledge today, and the fact pattern, right, everybody? That's where it came from. We split off these poor populations. We split off the wet markets. We split off the suffering of animals. So the fact pattern, you get that, everyone? The fact pattern, to the best of our knowledge, of how this catastrophic pandemic was created was a failure of intimacy. That's what we mean. That's an entirely different thing to say. Now, paradoxically, and there's little beeps coming in on my computer, so I apologize for that. There's no way to turn off the sound. Okay, so stay with me, okay? Stay with me. So when we make a clip saying, thank you, coronavirus, that's also a failure of intimacy. You get that? When uber wealthy people that are not actually threatened month to month in any way make this kind of imagined song, which actually is split off from the actual suffering of real and vulnerable people all across the world, and there's such an obvious disconnect from the genuine pain happening, that's an intimacy disorder. So as Italian doctors, as we mentioned a few minutes ago, are choosing between who to give a ventilator to because the coronavirus is infecting both people, we don't thank the virus. Do you understand? So let's distinguish between turning fate into destiny. That's absolutely what this moment is about. We have to turn fate into destiny. And thanking the virus, right? And placing someone who happens to be our political foe outside of the circle. This is not a time for commodifying the virus. This is not a time for politicizing the virus. This is a time for actually not restoring intimacy, but creating a new emergent level of intimacy that the world's never known. So let's try and understand this deeper, okay? But before we go deeper, let's just pause for a second. Let's just pause with me for a second. Cha, right? I want to just give you one more example, and then we're gonna play Amor. David's gonna resonate the code, and we're gonna go deeper in together. It's so good to be with you. It's such an honor to be with you, right? We're trembling before Goddess. We have to hold every person. And again, I want to say it again, right? Literally, there's a blackout today on stories of individual people dying. But the people who are dying are people. And every death is a tragedy. And every death that we take for granted before the coronavirus is a tragedy. And every new death that's unnecessary is a tragedy. And every death that's caused by this global intimacy disorder is a tragedy, right? Death is a tragedy. Now, death's not the end of the story, and we're going to talk about the fear of death. We have an enormous amount of information, hardcore information, right, about death. So we're going to talk about that also, because there's a fear of death, right, that's playing among us, and we need to talk and speak directly to that. But right now, we have to do one thing and one thing only. I want to give you two examples. There's a book in the ancient text called the Book of Job. And Job is about a man who suffers. And Job's friends are fundamentalists in their new age. He has three friends, and they come, and each one explains to Job why he's suffering, why he's attracted into his life, right? Why it's sin for punishment, why it's right. And God, Spirit, infinity, the infinity of intimacy appears out of the whirlwind and says, no, fuck that. That's a direct biblical quote, maybe, right? No, don't. No, when someone's suffering, let's hold suffering in our arms. Let's feel your pain. Let's feel your joy. If this is a time for any of us to transition from the world, let's do it with so much depth and so much transformation and so much grace. And let's hold the fear and let's tremble before Spirit. Right? Wow. I'll tell you just one more example. Wild story about a man named Moses who lives in the old texts. And there's this Spirit, which we'll call God, who speaks to Moses in a book called the Bible. And God says, I'm going to take the people out of Egypt. It's the story of Exodus. Remember the movie Spartacus? That's another Exodus story. It's the story of Exodus, of leaving Egypt, of rejecting the status quo. And God says to Moses, I've got a plan. I'm going to liberate the people and transform history. And then somehow the Egyptian taskmasters oppress, hurt, make the people suffer more. And Moses turns to God and says, I don't care about your plan. I don't care about the transformation that you're going to bring. People are suffering. I will not stand for it, God. I will not participate in your divine plan, even if it's to make things better. And God says to Moses, you're my man. That's right. That's what I want to hear from you. You get that? Any theology that deadens our sensitivity to pain is not kosher. Whether it's a New Age theology or a fundamentalist theology. When we see pain, We live in a world of outrageous pain. The only response to outrageous pain is outrageous love. And the essence of that sentence, which is the core of the beginning of a new story, which is what we desperately need today. Because in order to create global action, which is utterly necessary more than ever, because the nature of catastrophe at this moment in time, at this phase shift in human history, and this catastrophe is a dress rehearsal for what's to come. The nature of catastrophe is we can respond to it if we're one world, if we're one heart, if we're one love, if there's concerted global action, if there's a concerted global response, and especially when that response has to be radical and transformative. And we can get to a concerted global response when we have a shared story. And that shared story begins with an understanding of what love means in the world, but not as a new age idea, not as a fundamentalist idea, but as the structure of the universe. But let's go to the beginning of the sentence. We live in a world of outrageous pain. The only response is outrageous love. Let me go to the beginning of the sentence before we talk about outrageous love and about amor, which we will. But we live in a world of outrageous pain. The only response is outrageous love. That's what that sentence means in the Dharma. It means you can't respond by thanking the virus. You can't respond by saying it's sin for punishment. You can't respond with the law of attraction. All of those are ways of looking away. We can sometimes step closer to each other, and we should. This is a moment of physical distancing and radical social intimacy. We can sometimes step closer. Sometimes, even in a relationship, we have to step back and create our space, but we never look away. Right? We never look away.